Hello, everyone. My name is Brett Labello. I'm the Director of Regional History and Genealogy at Pikes Peak Library District. And I'd like to welcome you to the June program of the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium. The Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium is our tight-knit community's venue to catch up and enjoy speakers talking about our community. Based on the initial responses to the evaluations from last session, we can concretely prove you all missed our normal symposium magic. I admit Zoom isn't the same as a meeting all day at East Library, but our regional history and genealogy team has been actively brainstorming ways to recreate that symposium magic. We're hopeful that we'll have something to announce at our program in July. In the meantime, I'd like to resume the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium as we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the founding of Colorado Springs. This is our second of 4 sessions over this summer, and I know you'll enjoy this great slate of speakers we have scheduled today. And if you can't make all the virtual programs throughout the summer, they will be recorded and posted on PPLD's YouTube channel. Logistically, we will have 3 20-minute long presentations today, and at the end of all 3, we will moderate a short Q&A with the presenters. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit questions for the speakers. We hope you all use the chat as a discussion board, not with the speakers, but with one another. This is a perk of virtual programming, and you can do that during the presentation. At this point, I'd like to introduce John Spears, our CEO and Chief Librarian of Pikes Peak Library District, to make a couple comments before we get the program started. John.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Spears. I'm the Chief Librarian and CEO of the Pikes Peak Library District. The Pikes Peak Library District is a nationally recognized system of public libraries that serves all of El Paso County. With 15 facilities, online resources, and mobile library services, PPLD responds to the unique needs of individual neighborhoods and the community at large. One of the ways that we do that is through the Regional History and Genealogy Department. History is a critical component in developing the intangible feelings for that place that we call home. Whether it's the memories we hold or the stories that are passed down through families, conversations, commemorations, or gatherings like this, our history anchors us to a place, this place. The story of iconic Colorado Springs locations such as Glen Erie, the Broadmoor, and Cheyenne Mountain, all of those influence who we are as a community today. The activities and the people who live there all loom very large in our collective memories, and they help us build a foundation, not just for the now, but for future generations, to know what it means to be a member of this community. History builds community, and the community also builds its own history. As a part of the community, this event is a product of the efforts of so many that I want to recognize. First, our sponsors, the Helen and James McCaffrey Fund for Regional History, the Friends of the Pikes Peak Library District, and the Pikes Peak Library District Foundation. We have partners, the Pikes Peak Community College, Pikes Peak Genealogical Society, Pikes Peak Posse of the Westerners, the Western Museum of Mining and Industry, and the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And then finally, and probably most importantly, are the staff that makes events like this possible. And it is staff from across the entire district, our communications department, the entire regional history and genealogy team. And there's one person that I want to recognize specifically with that, and that's Chris Nickel. Chris Nickel was instrumental in the creation and the development of the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium, and she retired after 20 years of dedicated service to the library and the community. I want to thank her personally on behalf of all of the library staff for everything that she's done and give her thanks for her hard work throughout her many years with PPLD. And now it's my real distinct honor to introduce Susan Fletcher. Our first speaker, Susan Fletcher, serves as the Director of History and Archives for the Navigators in Glen Erie. She is also the founder and CEO of History Joy Consulting, an archives and museum consulting fund. Fletcher is the co-author of Exploring the History of Childhood and Play Through 50 Historic Treasures, the co-author of Dawson Troutman in his own words, and she's written numerous chapters on state and local history for the Pikes Peak Regional History book series. In addition to her scholarly work, her writing appears in Springs Magazine. Susan is a previous Regional History Symposium presenter and author, and now to present Glen Erie at 150, Susan Fletcher.
All right, well, thank you so much, John. While we're starting, I also wanted to thank Chris Nickel for her, just her leadership in the symposium and for her friendship over the years. So let's get started. Today, it's my honor to talk to you about Glen Eyrie at 150 plus. So just like the city of Colorado Springs is celebrating its sesquicentennial, Glen Eyrie is celebrating its sesquicentennial as a built environment and a home for General Palmer and a number of other people. Now, of course, the Glen is way more than 150 years old. Based on geological time, its order of creation. Indigenous people have been around at Glen Eyrie for a really long time. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But Glen Eyrie is most well known as the home of General William Jackson Palmer. So we like to say that the built environment at the Glen started in 1871. A large eagle's nest on a rugged cliffside inspired the name of Glen Eyrie, Valley of the Eagle's Nest. Scottish landscape architect John Blair suggested the name after seeing the majestic bird soaring high above the valley. According to a Denver newspaper in 1871, Glen Eyrie is a wild, romantic spot, and nothing but a romantic turn of mind would have prompted any human creature to build a costly habitation in such a place. It is simply a little opening or park of a few acres among the rocks with a natural gateway on the east between two great ledges of red and gray sandstone, with the mountains rising abruptly on the west and the vast monuments and ledges of rocks on every hand worn and chiseled by time into 100 fantastic figures. Kara, let's go on to the next slide here. Stone hearths and fire rings in Garden of the Gods indicate human presence adjacent to Glen Eyrie for at least the past 3,000 years, if not longer. Indigenous people were present in the Glen Eyrie region long before General Palmer arrived on the scene in 1869. Historian Leah Davis Withrow writes, for the Utes, this is their ancestral homeland. Culturally and historically, this is their place of being. In addition to Utes, many other tribes had ties to the region, including the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. As a cultural crossroads, the iconic red rocks at nearby Garden of the Gods served as a landmark and meeting place. According to historian Donald McGilchrist, during the harsh winter of 1844 through 1845, several Utes used the Glen as shelter and camped there for much of the season. So the establishment of Colorado City, Colorado Springs, and eventually the establishment of Glen Eyrie as a home for General Palmer happened against a backdrop of very complicated and often tragic relationships between Indigenous people, European settlers, and the United States government. According to Leah Davis Withrow, as a result of Western settlement, the Indigenous people of the Pikes Peak region were removed from a place where they had been for hundreds and thousands of years. Today, the Indigenous people of Colorado have living and vibrant cultures, acknowledging the sacredness of this region as their ancestral lands. Let's go on to the next slide. So that's what was happening out here long before General Palmer arrived on the scene. Let's jump into 1836 and talk about General Palmer now. So William Jackson Palmer was born to Matilda Jackson and John Palmer on September 17th, 1836 on Kinsdale Farm in Delaware. This is a picture of their farm. The family moved to Germantown, Pennsylvania when William was young. According to historian Donald McGilchrist, Palmer was reserved on the outside, but good-humored and kind in his heart. He had a remarkable persistence, a determination to build a neat, trim, happy, and sensible world. He possessed not only persistence, but energy and vision. Palmer joined the Union Army in 1861, as you'll see in the next slide, and commanded the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. In March 1865, President Abraham Lincoln confirmed Palmer for appointment to the brevet grade of Brigadier General. After the war ended, Palmer returned to a career in the railroad industry. In 1867, he joined the Kansas Pacific Railroad to survey possible routes throughout the Southwest. In 1869, Palmer met a beautiful 19-year-old woman named Mary Queen Lincoln Mellon, who was traveling with her father, William Mellon, aboard a train from St. Louis to Cincinnati. And you'll see a picture of her in the next slide. This striking beauty intrigued Palmer, and he wanted to know more about her. Queen had been given her nickname in childhood. She was born March 26, 1850, in Prestonburg, Kentucky. She was a bright and tender-hearted young woman who loved art and music, and during their conversation aboard the train, Palmer fell in love with her. After their journey, they met up again and began a sweet courtship and became engaged soon thereafter. In the midst of this romance, Palmer encountered the Pikes Peak region for the first time. During a railroad survey for the Kansas Pacific in July 1869, he rode atop the carriage in the warm night air on his way to Colorado City. He awoke from a nap to find the bright moon illuminating the summit of Pikes Peak. His party camped for the night, and the next day he explored the area. He and his party, which we think included his friend George Motley, enjoyed the stunning rock formations at Garden of the Gods, the towering mountains, and the fresh summer air. We're not sure if he ventured into the Glen Eyrie Valley on that particular trip or sometime in the future, but on whatever occasion it was, he eventually ventured into a rugged valley immediately north of the famous rock formations. To his delight, he found a magical landscape with mountains rising high to the west. A wild mixture of geological formations and life zones composed the valley. Rugged Dakota hogback hills stood guard at the entrance of the valley. Fossilized sea creatures awaited discovery in the soft sandstone. The steep canyon to the west held colorful layers of Pikes Peak granite, Saguache sandstone, Peerless dolomite, and Manitou limestone. A sparkling stream flowed out of the canyon and throughout the entire valley. The uplifted Lion's Red rock formations towered towards the bright blue sky. Although the valley was only a few short miles away from the frontier settlement of Colorado City, this place seemed like a world unto itself. Palmer fell in love with the valley and determined to live there the rest of his days. He also dreamt of a nearby summer colony where all of his friends would live. He shared his vision with Queen, telling her of his confidence that there would soon be a famous resort near the finest springs of soda and the most enticing scenery at the confluence of Fountain and Monument Creeks. He shared plans to build a narrow gauge railroad running from Denver to Mexico. He was excited to share his future in the Pikes Peak region with his beloved Queen. Let's go on to the next slide. The couple married on November 7th, 1870 in Flushing, New York. Palmer used his honeymoon time for he and his business associates, including Major Henry McAllister, to secure funding to purchase 15,000 acres of land in El Paso County, Colorado, for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and the Fountain Colony. And on the 31st of July, 1871, the first stake for the Fountain Colony was driven. With the colony and railroad underway, it was time for the Palmers to build their home in the valley they dreamed of. After their honeymoon, William and Queen returned to the United States. Palmer left his new bride back east while he traveled to Colorado to prepare their new home. He hired Greeley-based architect J.L. White and builder L. Whipple to design and construct a house at Glen Eyrie. Upon realizing that construction wasn't going as quickly as planned, Palmer asked his father-in-law to obtain tents from the government second-hand store so he and his new bride would have a place to live. Back east, Queen was understandably less than thrilled about the prospect of moving into a tent for several months in the middle of winter, but she came out anyway. She arrived in October 1871, accompanied by her father and her stepmother, Ellen, along with her younger half-siblings. She and the Mellons lived in the second-hand tents at the Glen, and then they moved into the upper room of the barn once that building was finished. Palmer eventually returned to the Pikes Peak region and joined his bride. Both eagerly anticipated the completion of their house, which was delayed by harsh winter weather. In early 1872, the home was ready at last, and here is a picture of it. The family must have been relieved to move in after a lengthy construction process. The original house at the Glen was small in comparison to the castle that you'll see today if you visit the property, but it was luxurious for the remote Pikes Peak region in the 1870s. The original home is 3.5 stories tall with a full basement, a Gothic structure in the form of a cross. Apparently, Queen had requested the unique octagonal rooms. The Palmers enjoyed a parlor and many other amenities. Let's go on to the next slide, I think. From the bay windows, they could see the stunning canyon and the rock formations. In addition to the main house and stables, Palmer had a grand vision for beautifying the entire valley. He hired landscape architect John Blair to create ponds and gardens. Blair constructed rustic wooden bridges that spanned water features fed by Camp Creek. Palmer kept a demanding travel schedule, overseeing work on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. And in his absence, Queen spent extended periods of time on her own at the Glen. She hiked around the property and loved the majestic scenery. She stayed busy by establishing the first school in Colorado Springs and organizing theatrical and musical productions for the colony's residents. William and Queen had their first child in 1872. Little Elsie was born in October. Along with Elsie, the Mellon children, Queen's half-siblings, also lived on the property. And in the mid-1870s, visitor Grace Greenwood reported that children are everywhere, on the hillside, by the brookside, under the bridge, in a canyon, and about the barn, and all over their house. There were just so many places for a child to explore. When the weather was too bad to be outdoors, Elsie enjoyed playing with her toys in the Glen Eyrie playroom. The family's fortunes quickly changed, however. Queen's father, William, passed away, leaving his widow Ellen with 7 small children. Then, the banking crisis of 1873 forced the Palmers to briefly close the Glen. They rented a small house in town on Cascade Avenue for several months, and after their finances stabilized, they were able to return to their beloved Glen. In 1878, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad got into a railroad war with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe over rights of passage through Raton Pass and the Royal Gorge. The conflict exploded into an armed standoff. Back in Colorado Springs, General Palmer feared that Elsie might be kidnapped by the Santa Fe's men on her way to school in town. To keep her safe, he built a schoolhouse across the creek from their house at Glen Eyrie, and you can see that on the picture on the left. Eventually, the railroad battle involved the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe bringing in gunslingers Bat Masterson, and eventually this battle reached all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1880, the court settled the dispute. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe got rights through Raton Pass, and the Denver and Rio Grande could build in the Royal Gorge. Palmer resigned his position with the original Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in August 1883 and turned his full attention to the new Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. That new narrow gauge railroad would become a key player in the development of Southwest Colorado, linking the towns of Salida, Gunnison, Montrose, and Durango. So let's go on to the next slide here. With the stress of the Railroad War finally over, the Palmers decided to remodel their home at Glen Eyrie for the first time in 1881. They added an octagonal tower, creating an artistic sanctuary in the upper story for Queen. They also built additional barns, pools, and housing for their growing staff. They had beautiful gardens and even a grapery and a conservatory with a fountain and lilies. The family's fortunes quickly changed, however. After suffering a heart attack in 1880 at the young age of 34, Queen's health grew increasingly worse. After trying to endure full-time residence at high-altitude Glen Eyrie, Queen's heart condition required a total change of elevation and scenery. In 1884, Queen and her young daughters, who you'll see in the next slide, which included Elsie as the oldest, Dorothy as the middle daughter, and Marjorie as the youngest, decided to move to New York to try to make a life for themselves there. And then Queen eventually settled in England with her 3 daughters and without William. She had friends in the country, and the low elevation and climate seemed perfect for her recovery. Although she was sad to be separated from her husband by an ocean, Queen was already used to spending extended seasons on her own because of Palmer's frequent travel for the Denver and Rio Grande. Palmer remained in the US and kept in touch with his family through letters. We'll go on to the next slide. In 1894, Queen grew weaker and weaker and passed away on December 27th, 1894 from pneumonia and heart failure. She was only 44. Devastated over the loss of his beloved wife, General Palmer brought his daughters home to Glen Eyrie and Colorado Springs. In early 1895, the quartet settled into their new life at Glen Eyrie. The healing beauty and fresh air of the canyon was just what the grieving Palmer family needed after Queen's death. General Palmer and his daughters took long hikes through Garden of the Gods. Elsie, Dorothy, and Marjorie enjoyed picnics on the lawns and cooling off from the summer heat by wading in the creeks. We'll go on to the next slide here. In 1901, General Palmer sold the Denver and Rio Grande Western, and after the sale, he decided to transform his wooden frame house at Glen Eyrie into a beautiful stone manor. It was time to turn Glen Eyrie into a place that rivaled the country homes of the wealthy industrialists of the day. He hired construction manager Edmund Van Diest, along with a team of architects and craftspeople, to make his vision a reality. And here are some of the blueprints to Glen Eyrie Castle. Van Diest oversaw the work of regionally famous architect Frederick Sterner. Van Diest remarked, "There is little more than the exercise in mechanical efficiency in building the ordinary dwelling or business structure. But at Glen Eyrie, there was something more. Such a beautiful setting required all the artistry of the architect, in coordination together with the fulfillment in detail of the owner's desires and visions." Let's see the next slide. The stunning transformation of Glen Eyrie turned the estate into one of the most spectacular homes of the West. A drawing room, dining room, library, and Palmer's personal den beckoned guests to explore the first floor. Beyond the dining room were the famous Glen Eyrie kitchens, a flower arranging room, a butler's pantry, and a valet room. Stepping outside the glass conservatory doors, guests would go to the recreation hall in the basement of the brand new library wing. That space contained a bowling alley and a billiard room, bookshelves, and a Steinway piano. Nearby was a steam room lined with white tile and a marble Turkish bath. The home was one of the first residences in Colorado to have electricity, which Palmer generated himself at the new electric plant and powerhouse across the valley. Next, in the main house, Palmer installed a pasteurization plant to purify the milk from the Glen Eyrie dairy. There were several other outbuildings, including garages and barns. The carriage house could shelter several vehicles and also served as home for General Palmer's famous horses. It even had a bathtub for his dogs. Let's go on to the next slide. So General Palmer must have imagined spending out his older days happy in his home with his beautiful daughters. But tragically, this future is not to be. On October 27th, 1906, the unthinkable happened. General Palmer was paralyzed in a riding accident. He lived for another 2.5 years, and by the spring of 1909, General Palmer's health began its final decline. On a snowy day in March, the general and his chauffeur took a car ride around the beautiful Glen Eyrie. It was snow-covered, and it would be Palmer's last look at his beloved estate before his death on the 13th of March, 1909. After his death, Elsie told a friend that even in his final days, her father was always patient, and I feel is the truest example of courage that I have ever known or heard of. Let's see the next slide. In the years to follow, Glen Eyrie changed ownership numerous times. From 1909 to 1916, General Palmer and General Palmer's daughters got together with their old friend, Edmund Van Diest, to try to figure out what to do with the estate. In the summers, Van Diest leased the property to the Robin Hood Girls Camp and Nature Study School for use as a day camp. The campers, which you can see here in the photo, enjoyed riding horses, doing gymnastics in the rose garden, and playing baseball. And in 1914, film director Romaine Fielding of the Lubin Company leased Glenary for 9 months to create his masterpiece film, The Eagle's Nest. In 1914, the Palmer family finally decided to sell the Glen. And in 1916, a syndicate of investors from Oklahoma purchased the property. We'll go on to the next slide, and you can see their sales brochure. This company was called the Glenary Companies, and they intended to subdivide the valley into miniature luxury villas, as you can see in the next photo. These are the homes that they wanted to build on the property. This scheme was not financially viable during the First World War, and they were pretty relieved when another buyer offered to take Glenary off of their hands in 1918. As you'll see in the next slide, Alexander Cochrane, who was one of the wealthiest and most eligible bachelors in America, purchased Glenary in 1918 for $450,000. After a stormy and brief marriage to Polish opera singer Ganna Wolska, and with his own health failing, Cochrane decided to sell Glenary again. They held a public auction in 1927, as you'll see in the next slide. In 1927, and advertised the property in 50 newspapers across the country. Up for sale were 2 parcels of land. Parcel 1 was comprised of 3,000 acres, including the original Glenary property, as you'll see in the yellow portion below, along with the Chambers Ranch, which General Palmer had purchased from the Chambers family. Parcel 2 was comprised of another 3,780 acres, including the land to the north that Cochrane had purchased. That's the green area that you'll see to the north. So the Glenary property originally in Cochrane's day was quite large. The highest bidder at the auction failed to pay up, and after Cochrane's death, the estate remains with his holding company, the Hillbright Corporation. And Cochrane eventually passed away. Except for a few remaining staff members. Actually, let's go on to the next slide so you can see the 1927 auction. I love the photo and the pictures of the ladies in their 1920s clothes. So except for a few remaining staff members, the Glen sat mostly empty for almost a decade. Finally, in 1938, George and Susan Strake of Texas purchased Glenary for $200,000. It was big news, and the Gazette advertised this on the front page, as you'll see in the next slide. George Strake was the owner of Strake Petroleum of Houston and had an early adventurous life discovering the Conroe oil fields in Texas. The multimillionaire family intended to use Glenary as a summer home to escape the Houston heat and humidity, and the family enjoyed Glenary. Their boys swam in the pools, rode horses on the trails. The family also had a working ranch on the estate. Unfortunately, in the late spring of 1947, the blissful 9 years that the family had spent at their summer house came to an end. A cloudburst sent a catastrophic flood down Queens Canyon, overflowing the banks of Camp Creek and submerging much of Glenary. The insurance company put the salvage price of the estate at only $100,000. Strake spent the next 6 years working to repair the damage, but the enormity of the repair efforts convinced Strake to sell the Glen in 1953 at a listing price of $500,000. And let's look at the next slide. So meanwhile, the Navigators, a California-based parachurch organization, was looking for a new home. Founded in 1933 by Dawson Trotman as a ministry to sailors, the Navigators had outgrown their downtown Los Angeles office. Trotman's friend, Jim Rayburn, who was the founder of Young Life, had recently moved his organization to Colorado Springs and invited the Navigators to join him. Trotman also had a close partnership with Reverend Billy Graham, and many of the Navigators staff provided help at Graham's famous crusades. While the Navigators searched for a new home, Graham also decided to buy a property to use as a retreat center or training academy. So the two ministries entered a deal to purchase land together. Trotman visited Colorado in 1953, searching for a suitable location. Real estate agent Gus Hill heard of Trotman's interest in the area through Jim Rayburn, and he brought Glenary to his attention. Dawson fell in love with Glen Eyrie at first sight and recommended it to Billy Graham, and the two ministries were supposed to buy the property together. So in the photo that you see here, this is a picture of Dawson Trotman along with Billy and Ruth Graham at the gates of the Glen. Eventually, Graham's advisors decided that owning a property would distract him from his lifelong work, and Graham encouraged the Navigators to purchase the Glen for themselves, which was a major financial challenge for the small organization. There are only 6 weeks left on the option to buy, and the required deposit of $110,000 exceeded the ministry's annual operating budget. Within those 6 weeks, the Navigators launched an ambitious fundraising appeal. Many donors gave sacrificially, selling their belongings, including cars and wedding dresses. The last gifts came in on the final hour of closing day in September of 1953, just in time to seal the deal. And in an amazing show of generosity and kindness, at the last minute, George Strake included in the sale one of the old Palmer reservoirs at the top of Queens Canyon and its surrounding land for use as a youth camp. Since 1953, the Navigators had stewarded the legacy of this beautiful property. The Navigators continued to own and operate Glen Eyrie as a conference center and a retreat center. And if you have not had a chance to visit the Glen, I invite you to participate in the life of the property. You are welcome to make reservations to stay overnight, to come for a tour, to come out for a tea, to attend a madrigal dinner, or to attend any number of events that the Glen has going on. In July, the Glen will be participating in some of the sesquicentennial celebrations that the rest of the city is doing. We invite you out in mid-July for Founders Day for some celebrations that will be happening. So look in the news for more information about that. And then excitingly, we actually are just publishing a book about the history of Glen Eyrie. Kara, if we could post the link to pre-order the book. The book itself will be released sometime in July. It's at the printer right now, so we're hoping it'll get back in July. But if you're interested in buying a copy of a book that I co-wrote along with some of our the bookstore manager, Amy Birch, featuring beautiful photography of the property, historic images, you can click on the link to pre-order the book. So I certainly hope to see you all at the Glen sometime, and I'll be available probably. I don't know if we're taking questions at the very end, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them whenever the question time comes around. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan. And yes, you're absolutely correct. We will be taking questions at the end of all three of the presentations. We will just maximize our time and jump right into Dr. Noel's program. So we'll introduce him. Dr. Thomas Jacob Noel is Professor of History and Director of Public History, Preservation, and Colorado Studies at the University of Colorado, Denver. Tom is the author or co-author of 53 books and a longtime former Sunday columnist for the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post. Tom completed his BA at University of Denver and his MA and PhD at CU Boulder, where his mother, a psychiatrist, and grandmother, a teacher, also did their graduate work. In 2018, History Colorado appointed Tom the Colorado State Historian. His presentation today is titled Broadmoor Visionaries, Count James Portales, Spencer Penrose, and Philip Anstutz.
Thank you, Brett. And thank the Pikes Peak Library District for putting on this symposium and its interest in regional history. And I must say it's been great fun researching here in Colorado Springs at the Penrose Library and that wonderfully restored Carnegie Library with a great view out of Pikes Peak and the city. Hope you'll enjoy this today. It was a look at the Broadmoor in a broader perspective of three founders, not just Spencer Penrose, but the original visionary, Count James Portales, and then Philip Anschutz, who took over a few years ago and has put more than $600 million into expanding Broadmoor World. And the next slide. Broadmoor needed a grand hotel, as you can see from this photo from the library. A town like this needed some kind of place to put up investors, travelers, tourists, or whatnot, and this would not do the trick. So it was a matter of building a better hotel than this log cabin. Okay? And that fell to Count James Bertalis from Silesia, which later becomes a part of Prussia, is now a part of Poland, as I understand it, in Central Europe. Let's go on. He was drawn not just by investment opportunities, but by Cherche La Femme, the Countess Bertha Bertalis, who settled in Colorado Springs and was quite a magnet for the Count himself. They did ultimately marry. Okay. This is Glembolwitz, if I'm pronouncing that correctly by any chance, of the Bertalis family estate, which his grandfather had founded back in Silesia. And the Count James inherited this, tried to run this as almost a medieval feudal village there grouped around the great estate. One of the interesting features here was that there was a large lake in front of this palace, a dream that would come true in Colorado Springs. Okay, this is the site, and this was the Broadmoor Dairy Farm here on the site of what will become the Broadmoor Hotel. You can see Cheyenne Mountain in the background. Okay. And the Broadmoor Dairy, founded by another man, but became the property of Count James Bertalis, who was very much interested in agriculture as well as in hoteling, and promoted this as the oldest and finest dairy in Colorado Springs. Lots of great dreams from Bertalis of these plans, and take a look here with the casino in the foreground and the hotel on the other side of the lake. He had a lot of trouble damming up Cheyenne Creek to create Cheyenne Lake in the middle of the Broadmoor. The lake kept disappearing. He finally figured out that it was prairie dogs that were the villains here, not the victims, but the villains. And they become the victims as he figures out a way to evict prairie dogs to keep water in what's still Cheyenne Lake. Okay. The original Broadmoor Hotel here you can see is nowhere near as elegant as the later pans. This was actually after Bertalis lost the property in the silver crash of 1893. Other investors had it over short terms for the next few years, and one of them built this hotel in 1991. This casino was not destined to fare well. This great fire destroyed much of it, as you can see here from the Colorado Springs Gazette headline. But it was slowly rebuilt, but again, nowhere near as grand as the original dream that Count Bertalis had for the casino and for a later hotel. Okay? And here is that first casino. This is the reality, not quite as grand as the actual drawing you saw a few slides back. And this attracted people from, let's go back one, Kara. This attracted people from Colorado Springs which was a dry town, because they served liquor and they had gaming here. So the sporting set, the lively set, the hard drinking set would head for the Broadmoor Casino and have their fun and games there. Okay. William Scott Stratton, who shows up so often in the Pikes Peak area history, after making his fortune with the Independence Mine, buys into that property to build a Stratton estate for elderly indigents, and also, as I understand it, for poor kids, as well as his father and other seniors there. He buys much of the original Broadmoor property to put up the Stratton home as we know it today. Okay. Herndon Davis, a great artist here in Denver, came up with this portrait of Herndon Davis that I thought maybe you hadn't seen before. It's at the Colorado History Museum, or History Colorado as it is called today, along with the rest of Herndon Davis's portraits of many early Coloradans, including General Palmer, many folks of Colorado Springs interest. Okay. Spencer Penrose is the black sheep of a prominent Philadelphia family. His father was a surgeon and a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. His 5 brothers all went to Harvard and did very well there. Spencer did not do well there. He set the record, they claim, to this day for drinking the most beer in a matter of 10 seconds. I think it was a whole pitcher of beer in 10 seconds, or probably less than that, come to think of it. At any rate, he's one of these black sheep whose family probably tell him, why don't you go west? We'll send you money. Just stay away from Philadelphia and embarrassing your mother and me. He heads west, and there he runs up with an old family friend, Charlie Tutt. And the two of them buy into the cash on delivery mine, or the COD mine in Cripple Creek. This was the first great producer there in Poverty Gulch. You can see they start out with a pretty primitive arrangement. I think that's Spencer Penrose, if you can see this slide in the black suit there in the foreground. And then sell it to a French syndicate for, gosh, I think it was like $500,000. And this becomes a great first cash on delivery payment in the Pikes Peak region. Penrose and Tutt form a lifetime partnership and many, many investments. Okay? But it's important to remember where that money really came from. And again, Tutt was in on this project too, but I think Penrose becomes a major investor in the Bingham Canyon, Utah copper mine, some 25 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. You can see this huge operation. It's still in operation today, extracting copper from low-grade ore. And they claimed at one time to be the world's largest open pit mine, and something you could see from outer space and satellite, this huge hole in the ground. And it paid off continuously through the hard times, the depression, all of that. It was paying Penrose something like $1 million after taxes, after expenses. And so this is what really finances the Broadmoor Hotel, is this hole in the ground in Utah. Okay. Tutt and Penrose quickly graduate from mining with a COD mine into where the real money is, the real estate, the mines, the stocks, and the ore smelting business, the ore processing product. That's the unglamorous end product of this, of how you extract the gold, the silver, the zinc, the lead, any other payable minerals from that ore, that fabulously rich Pikes Peak ore. Colorado City becomes the center for their huge smelter there. In Colorado City today, you still see a huge pile of waste rock and rage debris from their great smelter there, which processed many of Cripple Creek's fine ores. And Cripple Creek is as that wonderful historian tells us, who am I trying to think of here? Who wrote Newport in the Rockies? Marshall Sprague. Marshall Sprague describes it well, that Cripple Creek was producing out any other mining district, gold mining district in the world, even in South Africa or Canada or the Homestake mine in South Dakota. For a few years around 1900, it was the richest mining district in the world, and certainly the richest in Colorado. And of course, many of you know it's still paying off today for the Cripple Creek and Victor Mining Company. Onward. The Broadmoor was not the first great hotel in Colorado Springs, as I know many of you know. The Antlers, which unfortunately does not look anywhere near this elegant today, with its much larger, much less attractive replacement building. Palmer tried to buy this from the Penrose tried to buy this from the Palmer estate. He didn't have as much money as the Palmers wanted. And so he left the Antlers and to build the Broadmoor, the land he purchases in 1916. Okay. And now I wanted to focus more on the last part of the story, which is less well known. And that's Philip Anschutz, who in around 1990 buys in to the Broadmoor, buys it from the Gaylord family, praises them for their efforts, but then he greatly expands that empire. spending a fortune on remaking the Broadmoor West, which was in a modern style, nothing like the elegant old 1918 Mediterranean neoclassical style building. He completely redoes that. I think millions and millions on redoing the West to make it look more like the original hotel across the lake. And let's see, I think it's in the next slide. One of the things he does is to recreate the heads of Bacchus. I trust as you've entered the Broadmoor on the main entrance, you'll notice these heads over the 4 different portals there. That, of course, is the Roman god. Earlier that, the Greek god of wine, women, and song. And a very good indication of Penrose's character. He was one of the state's biggest playboys and quite the carouser, womanizer, chaser after skirts, until he finally meets Julie Penrose, who turns him from a playboy into a philanthropist, and he finally settles down. But the heads of Bacchus there on the original hotel, and now also recreated on the west side, the reconversion of the modern hotel to a neoclassical hotel. Anschutz's many additions included 7 falls. There had been a flood here that reduced 7 falls to 5 falls, wiped out the road, wiped out much of the scenery. Oh, I need to thank Ed Bathke. I think many of you know the wonderful Colorado Springs historian, Ed Bathke, for this photograph and many of the others, which I should have credited and didn't. But thank you, Ed, for this one. Anschutz spends a fortune restoring the 7 falls, and then what used to be a crowded road jammed with a lot of traffic, he converts to a pedestrian path and a shuttle from the Broadmoor Hotel to take you up to 7 Falls, now a property of the Broadmoor complex, and greatly enhanced with a very elegant 1858 restaurant at the base of this, another 5-star Broadmoor style restaurant. Okay. Anschutz has also spent hundreds of millions of dollars on restoring the Pikes Peak Cog Railway from 2 cogs to 1, completely reworking these vehicles, giving this a long-needed overhaul that no one else could afford, with a lot of help from Manitou Springs and also from Colorado Springs, which helped build a great new visitor center on top, which is opening this year. This wonderful Queen Anne style depot in Manitou, now also happily restored. And after 3 years of hard work, completely updating this whole operation, this is now back in operation this summer. Okay. Anschutz also buys what had been Penrose's old Cheyenne Mountain Resort there to put up Cloud Camp, the most elegant roughing it site in the state today. I think it's $1,000 a night or so, with the price rising. Called Cloud Camp. And if you haven't been there, it's an amazing, almost like a museum of Western art and artifacts from Anschutz's many investments in Hollywood, where he wound up with things like the Lone Ranger's gun belt, complete with the silver bullets. Oh, and to backtrack a little bit on Philip Anschutz himself, it's an incredible story. A German from Russia, from Kansas, whose father had a ranch where they found oil. And the Anschutzes had a habit of buying ranches which seemed to turn into great, very productive oil wells. And Anschutz himself, Philip Frederick Anschutz, seemed to have a Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to a fortune. An early example of this was his oil fields up in Wyoming, which caught fire. It looked like this was going to be a huge money loser, huge amount of money where much of the Anschutz fortune had been sunk into, when Anschutz, in touch with Hollywood, manages to sell the burning site to Hollywood for a John Wayne movie, Hellfighters, excuse me, was the title of that movie, as I recall, with John Wayne in it 30, 40 years ago. Maybe some of you have seen that. From there, he gets into real estate in downtown Denver and elsewhere. gets into everything you can imagine, including telecommunications, where he starts buying up railroads for the right-of-way to put in fiber optics along that rail right-of-way out to California, the West Coast, and whatnot. Also gets into journalism, buying up newspapers, including the current Colorado Springs Gazette, Telegraph. Gets into what else? Oh yeah, communications with newspapers we mentioned. And you name it, he's involved with it. Most recently, he's getting into wind energy, solar energy, in the connection with his oil business. He's also become quite a philanthropist in the Denver area, building the Anschutz Medical Campus out in Aurora, moving the University of Colorado Medical Center from its old downtown Denver complex, where they were very much hemmed in without ability to expand to a huge square mile site, a wonderful new campus out in Aurora. But he also put in a huge amount of money into Broadmoor, expanding with things like Cloud Camp, which you see here. And I think our next slide, Kara, yeah, here it is, gives you the reason for the name of Cloud Camp. Zebulon Pike, on his 1906 trip up the Arkansas River, hoped to climb Pikes Peak, and I think you all know the story. He actually got up Cheyenne Mountain, which you see here. And from there, he looked down and wrote about this view of the plains looking like a sea in a tempest and a storm. Very eloquent description, which inspired Penrose and later Anschutz to turn this into a site. That huge flag, by the way, you can see all the way from the Broadmoor Hotel there on the horns, is this rock outcrop is called. And one of the things staying there is to get up early in the morning, which I managed to do. I usually don't, to get up and see the sunrise over this sea of clouds smothering Colorado Springs and the Great Plains. By the way, from the crags here, the horns here, you get a 360-degree look out on the plains here. Looking back to the northwest, you see Pikes Peak and then the entire front range of the Rockies from this outcropping. Okay. Here is the interior of this rustic style with a lot of art. The whole Broadmoor complex now is decorated with cliches of Anschutz's collection of Western art, said to be the best private collection of Western art in private hands in the country. Incredible collection that Anschutz has been building up over the decades. And he's made reproductions of this, exact reproductions called giclées, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, French word, where you actually see the texture in the painting and get a very exact reproduction, which most of us could not tell from the original. And these great Western works by Remington Russell, the Fowles School of Artists, now decorate Cloud Camp and all the rest of that expanded campus. There's also some, oh yeah, and here is another site of his, the fishing camp, paradise for high-end anglers. These are 3 new wilderness resorts, as they're called, a Cloud Camp, fishing camp, and I've forgotten the name of the other one, but also a resort, which was also a favorite camping spot of Penrose that Anschutz studied and put up a resort there on that site. Okay. And here we have the Broadmoor, the famous Maxville Parish drawing, which I thought was a great way to maybe close this with this great dreamy look at the Broadmoor. A dream originally dreamed by Count Portalis, built upon, actually turned into reality by Spencer Penrose, and lastly, greatly expanded on by Philip Anschutz. And of course, the Broadmoor you see today is greatly expanded over what you see here. I started out this essay with a look at hotels, including that miserable first hotel in Colorado Springs, and how important this was to a community. The Broadmoor really brought the world to Colorado Springs. Other than to get a great look at Pikes Peak, early visitors didn't have much to say, where to eat, where to stay, where to dine, until the Broadmoor rises. And this was the dream of every town in Colorado, even these small mining towns, to have a grand hotel where investors, Easterners could stay, get an impression that this was going to be a progressive, booming town. In Denver, we have the Brown Palace, the Oxford Hotel. Up in Boulder, the Boulderado. Even in little towns like Silverton, you have the Grand Imperial Hotel. Glenwood Springs, with its great hot springs, has its wonderful Hotel Colorado, which almost matches Broadmoor for the original building. And every other town of note in Colorado now has a remarkable hotel. And I think I'll stop a little early and give us some time for Kara for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Noel. We will hold the questions until the end of the presentations, and at which point we will have all three of our presenters jump back on and we can moderate a Q&A at that point. I believe our next presenter is Eric Schwab. And let me make sure that and Eric is here and ready to go. Eric Schwab is married with a son and 3 grandchildren. As a volunteer for the National Forest, he has researched the Fremont Experimental Forest, the Skeleton Mountain Ranch, the Manitou Incline, and the Monument Nursery. He has given numerous talks on his research. He has prepared exhibits for the Old Colorado City Historical Society and the Manitou Springs Heritage Center. He is also engaged in several other research projects focused on his passion for the history of human activity on Pikes Peak. Eric's also been a previous Regional History Symposium presenter. The title of his talk today is 3 Trails That Ring Cheyenne Mountain, 3 Tales of Bribery, Provocation, and Infidelity. Eric, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Brett. I'm just going to jump right in. Go ahead and show the first slide, Carol. This map was surely created for the benefit of the guests of Spencer Penrose's Broadmoor Hotel. The small A is in Broadmoor is a giveaway. The Pikes Peak Camping and Mountain Trail Association, seen in the subtitle, was an exclusive wilderness club formed by Penrose in 1923. This map probably dates from the early 1920s. 3 of the trails shown on the map are named for his friends and his business associates. They are the Blackmer Trail, beginning at Penrose's Cooking Club and running along the eastern and southern foot of Cheyenne Mountain and ending at the saddle between Rock Creek and South Cheyenne Canyon. The McNeil Trail, which starts where the Blackmer Trail ends and runs along the west face of Cheyenne Mountain to the Horns, the current location of the Broadmoor's Cloud Camp. The Doherty Sunrise Trail, running from Cloud Camp down the north ridge of the mountain to the old stage road. The first directors of the Pikes Peak Camping and Mountain Trail Association were Henry Blackmer, Charles McNeil, and Russell Doherty, along with Spencer Penrose, John Bradley, and Charles Tutt. Initiation fees were $1,000, and the annual dues were $100. The camp is now the Broadmoor's Ranch at Emerald Valley. Who were these gentlemen that were the namesakes of these 3 trails? Charles McNeil came to Colorado in 1885 at the age of 14. He married Estella White in Colorado Springs in 1897. They were mentioned in the society columns of the Gazette They were divorced in 1905. Charles married Marion Parsons in 1910 in Paris. This union lasted for the rest of their lives. Charles learned the business of extracting gold from ore in Aspen and Leadville. With this knowledge, he joined Spencer Penrose and Charles Tutt to form the Colorado Philadelphia Reduction Company in 1896. Within 5 years, the partnership owned mills in Colorado City, Florence, Goldfield, Canyon City, and renamed the company the United States Reduction and Refining Company. Their main plant in the Midland area became one of the largest of its kind in the United States. Wanting to control the transportation of ore from their mills, Penrose, Tutt, and McNeil, along with Clarence Hamlin and Albert Carleton, acquired the majority interests in the Midland Terminal, the Florence and Cripple Creek, and the short line railroads. The Florence and Cripple Creek closed in 1912 and the short line in 1919, leaving the Midland Terminal and the Colorado Midland Railroads the only means of transporting ore out of the Cripple Creek district. McNeil and Penrose were also partners in these companies. Cripple Creek Gold made McNeil, Penrose, and Tutt millionaires, but it was their development of copper in Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and Alaska that brought them great wealth. In 1902, after the Western Federation of Miners won their 1894 strike in the Cripple Creek district, they organized the mill workers in Midland. The mill owners hired a Pinkerton detective to infiltrate the union. 42 workers were identified by the detective and were fired for joining the union. The union then demanded reinstatement of these men, plus the right to unionize, the payment of higher wages. McNeil refused to negotiate with the workers, provoking the strike of 1903 and the subsequent labor wars. Non-union men were hired to keep the plants operating, causing significant tension. McNeil demanded 250 guards to protect his mill. 300 National Guard soldiers were brought in to escort strike breakers to their work and also to search the homes of union men and to keep watch on the Union Hall. The situation deteriorated. Cripple Creek miners struck in Colorado City. The governor sent nearly 1,000 National Guard troops to Cripple Creek. Violence flared on both sides. Lives were lost. Mine workers were deported. McNeil fired the 200 workers that had walked off the job. This action brought an end to the strike in 1904. McNeil used the same tactic again in Utah, refusing to rehire the workers that walked out in order to break a 1912 strike. McNeil invested $350,000 in Penrose's hotel. He and Marion lived in a 6th-floor apartment, which they had a hand in designing. McNeil lost a major portion of his fortune in the stock market. He died in New York in 1923, leaving only $1.5 million to his wife, Marion. Henry Myron Blackmer was born in Worcester, Massachusetts on the 4th of July in 1869. He moved to Colorado Springs before 1890 with his widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. He married Helen Kerr in 1891. Henry, a lawyer, was a member of the Cheyenne Mountain Country Club, of the Penrose Cooking Club, the Sons of the Revolution, the Society for Colonial Wars, the Denver Country Club, the Denver Athletic Club. The Blackmers were mentioned in numerous society columns, listed in the Who's Who in Denver Society and the Blue Book in Colorado Springs. When Henry was El Paso County's 4th Judicial District Attorney, Henry McAllister was his assistant. That relationship developed into a law practice in 1896 that lasted until 1907. Blackmer was involved in organizing these companies, sometimes with Henry McAllister, John Armitt, and others. He was also involved in high-profile cases in the early 1900s. One of these was the defense of the Jackson franchise. In 1899, Blackmer, Albert Carlton, and George Jackson filed an injunction to keep the city of Colorado Springs from repealing the Jackson franchise. This franchise gave the Pikes Peak Power Company the right to use city water to generate electricity, which they sold to the citizens of Colorado Springs. Several prominent citizens felt that this was a bad deal for the city and convinced council to repeal the franchise. Blackmer and Associates were successful in stopping the repeal, and the power company sold electricity generated at the Manitou Hydroelectric Plant to the city until the franchise expired in 1922. Before his death, Winfield Scott Stratton appointed Henry McAllister as head executor of his estate. Stratton wanted the bulk of his estate used to establish a home for the poor. Many would-be heirs challenged the use of the Stratton fortune. To sort out these conflicts, Judge Orr appointed Henry Blackmer, Clarence Hamlin, and Oliver Grimes as administrators of Stratton's estate. The battle between Blackmer and McAllister over the settlement of Stratton's will went on for 13 years. McAllister prevailed, and the result is the Myron Stratton home, which still exists. Blackmer was the president of the Cripple Creek and Central Railroad Company, a holding company that Spencer Penrose, Albert Carlton, and Charles McNeil had put together. Blackmer was also interested in oil production. By 1916, he was the president of the Midwest Refining Company. Penrose believed that Blackmer was spending too much of his time in his oil interests and bought out his railroad shares. In the early 20th century, President Taft designated the Teapot Dome oil field in Wyoming as oil reserves for the Navy. In 1921, President Harding transferred control of these oil fields to the Department of Interior. In 1922, the Interior Secretary Albert Fall leased oil production rights at Teapot Dome to Harry Sinclair of Mammoth Oil, a subsidiary of Sinclair Oil. Henry Blackmer, Harry Sinclair, and Robert Stewart, Standard Oil of Indiana, organized the Continental Trading Company Limited, a Canada, of Canada, a dummy corporation set up to siphon money from the sale of Teapot Dome oil. Oil was sold to Continental for $1.50 a barrel. Continental then sold it to Sinclair and Standard Oil for $1.75 and kept the difference, except for kickbacks they gave to Albert Fall. Their competition noticed the low price charged Continental for Teapot oil and called it to the attention of Congress. In 1924, fearing he would be called to testify in a trial of Secretary Fall, Blackmer moved to Paris, France, leaving behind his family. In 1929, Secretary Fall was found guilty of accepting bribes. Becoming homesick, Henry hired a Denver cinema photographer to take movies of his home and ship them to France. After Helen divorced Henry, he married Lucy Carter, the daughter of the pharmaceutical family famous for Carter's Little Liver Pills. This marriage also ended in divorce. In 1939, he married Ida Norwina, the former Norwegian opera singer and actress. After 25 years in exile, the 80-year-old Henry Blackmer returned to the U.S. and faced charges against him. He paid a fine of over $3.6 million for tax evasion and his $60,000 fine for failing to appear in court. In return, the government released the $10 million of his frozen assets. Henry moved back to Switzerland, where he lived in comfort until his death at age 92. Russell Kersey Doherty is not as well known in Colorado Springs history. He was born in New York into the family of prominent Brooklyn socialites. He married Bertha Schultz in 1917. She was also from a prominent Brooklyn family. Russell and Bertha had traveled in the Near East with Spencer and Julie Penrose in 1921. By 1922, the Dohertys were living on Walnut Avenue in the Broadmoor. That year, they purchased the block across Lake Street from the prestigious Cheyenne Mountain Country Club. In 1923, Russell commissioned George Washington Smith, a Santa Barbara, California architect, to design a large Spanish colonial revival home to be built on their lot. The local architectural firm of McLaren and Hetherington were hired to oversee its construction. Russell was described as in the press as a capitalist. He had some connection with the Holly Sugar Company. He raised money to complete the conversion of the Colorado Midland Railroad right-of-way to an automobile highway. Russell and Bertha were involved in real estate development. Russell bought Block H in the Broadmoor Addition #1. Bertha purchased the block directly north of the site of their new home and a wedge-shaped parcel at the corner of Bertha Circle and Elm Avenue. She subdivided that parcel into 6 lots, naming it the Doherty subdivision. Before the Lake Avenue mansion was finished, Bertha sold it to Albert Carlton. I'm sorry, Russell sold it to Albert Carlton. We want to back up a slide, Cara. Thanks. Russell was having financial problems. He was late paying Smith's architectural fee, and the IRS filed a tax lien of more than $3,000 against his property. Finances were not his only problem. He took a fancy to Vera Stedman, one of motion picture producers Max Sennett's bathing beauties and a star of silent movies. Bertha filed for divorce, which was granted in 1926. In April of 1928, several newspapers chronicled Vera Stedman's trip across the country on her way to marry Russell Doherty in Atlantic City. Apparently, the marriage never took place. Vera's obituary only mentions 2 husbands, neither of which was Russell Doherty. Bertha sold her property in the Broadmoor and moved to New York City. The last we hear of Russell living in Colorado Springs is his 1926-27 residency in the Broadmoor Hotel. He turns up next in San Diego, California in 1929, having just arrived from Mexico. The passenger manifest lists him as married, but no wife accompanied him. There is little more heard of Mr. Doherty until his death in San Francisco in 1944. These 3 men were certainly well connected and notable in their time, but we might also consider them just a little bit naughty.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Eric. At this point, I think that we can open up our panel to some questions. And I know we've got a couple questions in the Q&A. So if you're a panelist, if you could please unmute and start your video again. I will say this.
Brett, you're muted.
Wow. Am I on mute? I guess so. I want to throw out and say to Chris Nickel that the pairing of all 3 of these panelists has been excellent. What I found for myself as an audience member is just sitting here and seeing all of these names that are really important to our community's history, but also then being able to see those real links going all the way up until today. So thank you, Chris, for the excellent pairing of all 3 panelists in their presentations. The first question that we have in the Q&A is for Dr. Noel. What became of Portales after he left Colorado?
He goes back to his home in Silesia, Glukowitz. And it writes rather bitterly about how sharp these Yankees are. Beware of dealing with Americans. He got fleeced several times over. There's a wonderful account of him, Adventures of Count James Mortalis, a book which provides all of this in great detail. One of the more interesting things about it too, Brett, and whoever asked that question, is that in that book he talks about American hotels and how much more space they give to public uses, like barbershops and cafes and saloons and parlors and whatnot. And he kind of describes in that book the ideal American saloon, American hotel, which of course he puts into his plans for the Broadmoor.
Fantastic. We've got another question here for Dr. Noel, and that is from, looks like William Thomas. Is it true that Spencer Penrose bought a bloodshot glass eye? If true, what's the backstory here? And did Penrose lose an eye at some point in his life? Did he drink quite a bit, and how did he survive Prohibition?
Yes, in my book, Pikes Peak Partnership, we have a photograph of that glass eye and the story. Tut at the Broadmoor still has possession of the glass eye, and supposedly in a rowing accident at Harvard, he knocked out one eye and put in a glass eye. But that glass eye would not reflect the hangovers he was subjected to in the other eye, so one eye would be red and stained with excessive alcohol, the other would be clear. So he finally found a doctor in Paris who managed to make a glass eye that had the red marks in it, which would match his morning hangover. But it's hard to believe that story, but take a look at the photograph and the Pikes Peak Partnership. And I guess it would be a great cocktail stunt to sit there and talk to somebody and pop your glass eye out and show it to them. You would get some attention that way.
I completely, when I read the question from William Thomas, I completely thought this was going to be some urban legend, but actually legit. Wow. I think this one is for Eric. Did James McNeill ever live in or around the Broadmoor area?
Who?
James McNeill?
Charles McNeill.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, he lived in the Broadmoor Hotel.
Ah, perfect.
Well, he had homes in New York also, but and he died in New York, but they did have that apartment in the Broadmoor.
Okay. And Eric, it's interesting that the names chosen for the trails were people of questionable character. Was it money or other reasons for the name choices?
Well, they were all close associates of Penrose, and I suspect that that's the primary reason. I doubt that he chose them because they were questionable character. I think all of those characters were of complex background, and probably dig into Penrose, we'd find some things that we would consider naughty as well. But I think it's primarily because they were friends and business associates, and he chose them as his board of directors for his wilderness club at Emerald Valley Ranch.
Okay, and I think we've got one for Susan as well. What were General Palmer and Queen Palmer's ages at their death?
Queen was 44 and General Palmer, let's see, he was born in 1836 and died in the spring of 1909. So I think he's 73, 76. Somebody who's better at math than I am can calculate that. In his mid 70s is a good answer.
Perfect answer. One of the things that, especially thinking about the Palmer, for me at least, has been that Glen Erie is actually, at least at the time that he built it, it's outside of Colorado Springs. The founder of Colorado Springs, yet he doesn't live in Colorado Springs. But you'd mentioned that during the construction, he was living on Cascade.
That was after they had already built Glen Erie. So it's actually pretty common for the day for men of Palmer's stature. I mean, he wasn't famous or rich when he founded the Springs, but it's not uncommon for men who eventually attain that socioeconomic status to not live in town. Glen Erie is part of what we call like the American country place era. So it's a Biltmore, a lot of homes in the East. These people will have big homes that are not in town. They're a little bit removed from the hustle and bustle of the city. And so it was in 1873 during the financial panic. The Palmers ran out of money and they had to close the estate for a few months, and then they moved into town for a little while. So economic crises are nothing new. Like 2020 was nothing, I mean, out of the ordinary, obviously, with the pandemic, but financial crises have happened before and they'll happen again.
Perfect. Thank you. We got one more for Susan, and I think a question for either Dr. Noel or Eric. I'll come back to both of you guys for that one. But Susan, could you tell us a little bit about how Palmer lived after his accident? Did he have to invent something to help him sort of get around?
Yeah, that's a great question. Palmer had a huge team of nurses and doctors and his staff members that allowed him to, you know, function to the best of his capacity. So a lot of people moved into the house to take care of him full time. He did buy some automobiles, and apparently he had some type of like a rubber bed in those automobiles that he could sit in, you know, be cushioned for the rides. I think the Pioneers Museum has photos of, I mean, because he was paralyzed, there was like a sling system next to his bed that I'm assuming they could lift him out of bed with. So he certainly employed, you know, whatever technology was available to him during that day. He was able to afford that, and he had an excellent care team that helped him. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I think at this point, we've got the last question that's so far on the Q&A list. So I'll throw this out to anyone that wants to take this. What is the significance of the small A in Broadmoor?
Brett, I think that is folklore, the best I can discover. Supposedly when Penrose tried to buy Antlers and was turned down on that as a slap in their face, he put the small A in the Broadmoor trademark. But maybe Eric or Susan can straighten that out. That's the story, but another source says no, it's urban folklore.
I've always heard that as a controversial story that nobody really knows the answer to. So if Eric knows,
Oh, I don't know
he knows
anymore.
something the rest of us don't.
Oh,
I
another
was just
version
wondering-
is that you couldn't trademark, the word Broadmoor had been trademarked, so they had to put the A in to make it different from the other Broadmoor.
Okay, fantastic. Let me see here.
Well, I wanted to ask Eric about something. Eric, you mentioned the labor wars. As you know, McNeil and Penrose are great villains for labor historians. And going through the Penrose papers, the file on Cripple Creek had been removed. But
really?
they were very good at smashing the unions there and pretty rough treatment of any strikers, with the state of Colorado in cahoots.
Wonder who removed it.
I do too. I suspect someone in power.
I wonder how much history gets lost that way.
Yeah, but Penrose, for instance, is never written off or people, but he would be funding those state militias, funding those private armies that were used to protect the scabs.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. And all three of our stories, I mean, there is another layer to the history of all of these, like the labor history and the history of strikes and unions, and you know, in almost all of these cases. So, you know, that's a good point.
Susan, on the other hand, Palmer has been very hard to debunk. He was apparently very good to his workers, and maybe you can straighten this out. When he sold the DNRG, actually gave profits to employees.
Yeah, that's actually, it's the Denver and Rio Grande Western that he sold. And apparently it's a true story. He gave a part of those proceeds to almost every staff member who worked for him, which I think is remarkable. I mean, General Palmer was certainly not a perfect man, but I think he was remarkably progressive in terms of his care and attention to his workers. So that's
And of course, a very enlightened city founder with all that public space, the broad streets, the land for the school of deaf and dumb, Colorado College, tremendous philanthropist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're still benefiting from Palmer's vision today, 150 years later, which I think is remarkable.
Well, thank you, everyone. I will make a last plug. We do have another virtual symposium on July 24th. The speakers for that are Leah Davis-Witherow, Eric Metzger, and Greg Atkins. You can sign up for that on our PPLD website, and we will also be sending out emails if you're on our email list about registration. But thank you very much for attending today. And thank you very much for our three presenters. I know that I took a lot away from this, and I really enjoyed our morning. So thank you, and a round of virtual applause, because I know that we all miss the big room, 100-some people applauding, but virtual applause. Thank you all.